Dr. Charles B. McIntosh, Debbie Buckland, Josh Martino, John Payton, and Dr. Johnetta Betch Cole. Celebrate their efforts to bridge divides and unite our community. onejax.org. The North Florida TPO is committed to shaping our transportation future. We're focused on planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, connected community. Learn more at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjax.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.
Good morning, I'm Ann Schindler. On today's First Coast Connect, condos in crisis. From skyrocketing HOA costs to mortgage blacklists, we talk about the new challenges of condo ownership with a local expert in condo and real estate law. Then, a local artist collaborative celebrating 20 years of supporting First Coast artists, both professionally and practically. And thinking outside the galaxy with our resident spaceman and planetarium director, Eddie Whistler. Join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org or tag us on social media. It's all ahead this hour after the day's news.
I'm from NPR News in Washington. I'm Corva Coleman. President Trump is marking 100 days in office this week. He rallied last night with supporters outside Detroit. Trump celebrated his numerous executive actions targeting subjects from immigration to tariffs. But NPR's Tamara Keith says Trump also noted some critics are opposed to what he's doing.
Last night, Trump complained repeatedly about polls he said couldn't possibly be valid. That's the raft of public polls out in recent days indicating Trump has the lowest approval rating at the 100 days mark of any president in 80 years. And like in his first term, significant parts of Trump's agenda are being held up in the courts. The courts and the polls are the two biggest hints of gravity that Trump is experiencing right now.
NPR's Tamara Keith reporting. The federal government says growth in the U.S. economy shrank in the first 3 months of this year. The U.S. economy declined 0.3% from what it was a year ago. That's very different from the annual 2.4% U.S. economic growth seen in the last 3 months of last year. The S&P 500 stock market index is down 7% since the president took office. That is the worst performance during a president's first 100 days in office in several decades. NPR's Laura Walmsley reports many Americans have been anxious about their retirement accounts.
Laura Anderson is 61 and teaches at a university in Cincinnati. She had been planning to retire in 5 or 6 years, but the market turmoil has given her pause, even after finding that her 401k hadn't dropped as much as she feared.
I just feel like there's so much uncertainty right now that I still don't feel like my original retirement plan is going to be doable.
Amy Rowland of Salt Lake City shares that uncertainty.
Part of me retiring is kind of that feeling of, yeah, it is probably time for my generation to step aside, but we can't do it if we don't think we can survive our retirement years.
It's a feeling that may cause those who can to keep working. Laurel Walmsley, NPR News.
President Trump has opened a new front in his battle with the media. He has targeted the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. NPR's David Folkenflik reports the CPB is now suing the White House.
The White House sent an email to 3 of the 5 members of the CPB board saying they had been fired and thanking them for their service. Thing is, it's not clear Trump has the power to do that. As it noted in legal filings, federal law states the CPB is not a government agency. The attempted firings are part of Trump's larger effort to strip public broadcasting of taxpayer funds. He says he'll ask Congress to pull back more than $1 billion already allocated by lawmakers for public broadcasting for the next 2 years. PBS and its member stations rely on federal funds from CPB for 15% of their revenues. For NPR member stations, it's 10% on average. NPR itself receives just 1% directly and a bit more indirectly in fees paid by stations. David Folkenflik, NPR News.
You're listening to NPR News from Washington.
You're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Stephen Ponson. It's now 9:04. Jacksonville is getting help to expand economic opportunities. The River City has been selected as one of 20 other communities to participate in the Southern Cities Economic Initiative. This 3-year program by the National League of Cities will provide grant funding and assistance to help individuals and families improve their economic standing. City officials did not respond to initial requests for more information about the grant, when the initiative begins, or how much funding will come to Jacksonville. Other cities in Florida that will be participating are Lauderhill and Pensacola. The U.S. Senate has confirmed Republican David Perdue as ambassador to China. Perdue is a former business executive who served 2 terms as Georgia's governor and 1 term as a U.S. senator from Georgia. Perdue was confirmed 67-29 with some Democratic support yesterday. At Perdue's confirmation hearing this month, he called the U.S. relationship with China the most consequential diplomatic challenge of the 21st century. President Trump this month slapped 145% tariffs on Chinese goods, and Beijing retaliated by charging 125% tariffs on U.S. products. It's going to be warm and dry today here in Northeast Florida. Highs will range from the lower 80s along the coast to mid to upper 80s inland, and we'll have plenty of sunshine. Overnight, mostly clear with lows in the 60s. We stay dry tomorrow as well, with highs reaching the upper 80s to lower 90s over inland areas.
News. Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Cy Sims Foundation, partnering with organizations and people since 1985, working for a better and more just future for all. More information is available at cysimsfoundation.org.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Good morning. I'm Ann Schindler, and this is First Coast Connect. Today, between soaring insurance rates, large special assessments, and mortgage blacklists, condo owners are facing a trifecta of financial headaches. We ask an expert what he's watching for from the markets and the Florida legislature. Later in the program, celebrating 20 years of artistic collaboration at the Art Center Co-op. But first, the tragic collapse of a Surfside condominium prompted a series of legislative reforms that some now say could prompt a different kind of collapse, this time an economic one. Here to tell us about it is Jacksonville real estate attorney Barry Ansbacher. Good morning, Barry. Thanks for being here.
Good morning, Ann. Thanks for having me.
And we should say that Ansbacher Law is an underwriter of WJCT Public Media. Barry, I wanted to get into some of the changes that led to this moment, but if you can, could you just explain what we're seeing right now when people are talking about a condo crisis in Florida?
Well, really what we're looking at is, just like everybody's housing and household expenses, the cost of staying in a condo's gone up. You have the issues of just homeowners insurance is the same thing for a condominium, only you have that many more units. So they're facing that pressure. You're also facing the issue of the cost of maintenance, the cost of management, the cost of personnel. All those operating costs in a condominium are costs that the owners of those condominiums have to pay, and that is certainly putting pressure on just the operating budget, even before you get to the new legislation that followed the Surfside tragedy.
And how does the new legislation come into play? We've seen that as a sticking point for a lot of people who say, you know, it raised the bar on how we have to put aside money as condo owners. It created this new threshold of needing inspections that could also tack costs on. Can you explain to us kind of what those regulations put into motion and how much you credit them with being part of what people are calling this crisis?
Certainly. What happened is really going back, not the current legislative cycle, which is wrapping up, but go back 2 cycles ago. So not even 24, but going back to 23. And in 2023, following the Champlain Towers, there was an evaluation over how did they get there. And when they did the studies, they said some of it was the original design, some of it was the construction. But one of the concerns that they really focused on is, was that condominium association properly maintaining and dealing with deferred maintenance and structural issues? And the outcome of that was a belief that too many condominium associations were not properly keeping up their buildings or reserving the money to do so. And what happens is, it's like anything else. If you've saved up for a new car and the money's in there and your car is, just won't start, it's a lot easier to go buy that new car if the money's in the bank account. And that's really a reserve fund that condominiums have always had to keep up with. But what they found is many condominium associations were not funding those reserves. So while the boards were required to budget for them, the membership could always override that reserve budget. And it was very common that they'd say, well, we'll do it next year, we'll do it next year. So as these deferred maintenance, as these large capital expenses came due, the directors didn't have the money in the budget because those reserves weren't there to do so. And the belief is that that caused them to push it even further and to do the minimal necessary, or really to avoid keeping up the buildings and keeping them in a safe condition.
And so the legislature basically issued a couple of requirements. One is something that I think you refer to as like the milestone money, and then kind of reserve study money. Can you explain what those requirements are, how they're separate, and what they ask of condo boards?
Certainly. What it comes down to is the issue of how we regulate building safety. We have a regimen that when you first construct a building or remodel, you have design and permits and inspections. But in general, there's no duty to ongoing inspect and make sure those buildings remain in a safe condition. If the building or code department becomes aware of something, then they would address it, but not on an ongoing basis. Now, Miami-Dade County, ironically, where Surfside occurred, had long had a 40-year certification program that buildings, when they got to be 40 years old, had to be inspected. Nowhere else really in the state had that. So what the milestone inspection does is really takes that Miami-Dade program and makes it statewide. So if you're dealing with buildings which are condominium and they have to be 3 or more stories, so it doesn't affect 1 and 2 stories or even small 3 stories. The first requirement is that they have an engineer or an architect come out and visually inspect the property and say, is there things here which present themselves as concern? If the answer is no, they're done. If they visually see anything of concern, the engineer or architect is required to perform testing, maybe remove wall segments, things like that, and do a phase 2 and determine if in fact there are concerns, and then write a report that gets sent to the building department and the homeowners in the condominium and the board that says these are things of concern that need to be repaired. Immediately, or certainly in the short term, and that's called the milestone inspection report. That is when a building reaches 30 years of age. But if it's a building that the local building department considers to be at higher risk, typically oceanfront, the building department can trigger that inspection for the first time at 25 years.
Okay. And then deferred maintenance, or this reserve maintenance fund, that's something that boards are now kind of more rigorously required to set aside money for.
Correct. The two aspects of it is the milestone inspection is designed to fix the past problems, to go back to all these buildings where for years they haven't been properly inspecting or maintaining them or repairing them. That's trying to fix all the problems in the past. The legislative plan to avoid this happening in the future was to have the reserve accounts as non-waivable. So they picked these structural items, roof, building painting, major things that would be over $10,000 that are life safety. So, for example, the pool furniture doesn't fall into this. So there may be other reserves that are for lifestyle or amenities that the associations can continue to reserve or waive as they choose. But for these structural items, what they really wanted to do is to give some teeth to the reserve laws and say for these reserves, these structural integrity items, they had to be established. And for any budget adopted this year, January 1, 2025 forward, so generally this will roll into effect with the 26 budgets because they adopt the budgets typically in November, December of the preceding year. So the 25 fiscal budgets were adopted last year, so they were before this implementation date. But the structural integrity reserve requirements have really two components. One is it sets the standard for these reserves that they have to be done by an architect, by an engineer, or by a structural integrity reserve designee who has certain special certifications from some accrediting agencies. They have to do that study, and they have to report these studies to the state, and then they have to reserve money so that the funding requirements for when a roof would need to be replaced, when structural items need to be addressed, that those items are funded. And unlike reserves in the past, the membership can't waive those.
And this is sort of what has led to this kind of moment, because those deadlines were supposed to take place at the first of the year. They were supposed to be, meeting these deadlines for these assessments, for these inspections. And you have a lot of condo boards saying we can't, or just not responding. You have a lot of condo owners saying we are being forced out. We can't afford to live in these places anymore. And so, and even places that people aren't being forced out of. I think, we all know somebody that's been trying to sell a condo, and they say, well, the HOA has gone up so much, I can't sell it. Nobody wants to buy it. It's doubled since I bought it. Now is almost as much as the mortgage on the condo. So, what do you believe is driving that particular like pricing out?
Well, the real issue is, are the monthly assessments or annual assessments artificially high now because of the legislation, or I would argue that they were always understated. If you go back to when a developer develops a condominium project, they have every incentive to make the assessments as low as possible because it makes the homes more attractive. And when you have directors who are serving, they're not going to be popular with their neighbors. They don't want to have to walk their dog at 2 a.m. in the morning to avoid their neighbors because they increased the assessments. So there's a lot of pressure to keep them down artificially, but some things just can't be helped. Insurance costs are going to go up and they can't avoid paying them. And these milestone inspection reports and structural integrity reserve studies are really forcing people to face the reality of what's always been there. Roofs have always worn out. Concrete with rebar in it has always had problems with the rusting of the rebar, with the salt, air, and corrosion. So these things in terms of buildings wearing out have always happened. The issue has been, have people been properly recognizing that in accounting for it, or have they been willfully ignorant for it and kind of just kicking the can? And I think that's really what this is. And I know that our own Senator Bradley has been all over the state and working on this legislation, has been the lead for many years. And I heard her say it at a panel. We were at University of Florida on a public policy panel, is we're not changing things with these laws in terms of affordability. We're just really shining a light on what has always been the condition. Whether you had the reserve requirement or not, in other words, that you're paying each month, or you got to the back end and now the building is collapsing and you have a special assessment for tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, either way, the building maintenance needs to be done and the safety needs to be maintained. It's, are you paying as you go, or are you going to have these unaffordable, huge special assessments on the back end, or possibly have the condominium just go into bankruptcy or be terminated because it just can't be maintained as a safe structure? So I think it really is in large part dealing with the truth of the situation. I don't believe this is one that the legislature is creating the burden. I think they're really simply causing people to be realistic about what it costs to stay in these buildings.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to real estate attorney Barry Ansbacher about Florida's condo crisis. If you have comments or questions, you can join the conversation. Give us a call at 904-549-2937. You can also email questions or comments to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org, or you can tag us on social media. And I hear what you're saying, Barry. It costs what it costs. And yet, there's been so much reporting on this issue by the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald. There was a story in the Palm Beach Post that was particularly striking of a homeowner that they interviewed who said, I bought this condo. My mortgage is $300 a month. They bought it in 2006. And his fees are now $2,100 a month. And so that is the real cost, as you would say, of what this condo costs. And yet it is clearly going to put people out of their homes if they are on a fixed income or just like anybody who can't afford to see their, mortgage effectively quintupled um, on a monthly basis. Is there something fundamental about the way that condos operate, are designed, work that is flawed somehow?
I think the issue that you have is governance. In some condominiums, you've always had good governance and they've handled the reserves and they've properly managed their buildings and maintained them. But in other communities, there's just been a failure of the leadership of those condominiums, the boards, because they nobody is a hero when they're raising assessments. And I think what happens is it's built up over 25, 30, 40 years. If you had been properly maintaining a lot of these buildings as you've gone along and properly reserving, they wouldn't be upside down. But think about it. If you've not done any maintenance on your car for 3 years and you take it into the service shop, it's going to need a lot more than if you're getting the oil changed every 6 months. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing, that these assessments have been artificially low. Now, there are certainly other issues that are driving it, just like businesses and people in their own household finances are having expenses go up. The cost of services has gone up. And of course, the cost of insurance, despite the so-called insurance reform that went through that was supposed to reduce rates, that has gone up significantly as well. So all those costs get passed through to the homeowners. There's nobody else to pay it. So if the condominium insurance cost goes up 30%, well, that's going to go through to each homeowner. It's going to have to pay their share of that. So you have a lot of factors working in terms of just the cost of living and inflation, and all those things are pushing through to the condo fees.
We've got a call from Robin on the South Side. Good morning, Robin. Go ahead.
Good morning. My question is around the comment you made earlier. You said if the architect or the engineer deems that the property can't be repaired and it needs to be or would be abandoned, who pays for the removal or destruction of that property? That's very expensive. So I was just wondering who would pay for that cost.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, let me clarify a little bit. What the architect or engineer in terms of these studies is doing is determining not whether it can't be repaired, but whether a repair is required. In other words, if they walk around and visually and it looks good and they don't see anything, then that's through and done. But if they walk through, for example, let's say they see cracking in the cement or they see rusting of rebar coming through, then what they're going to do is do further examination. In the same way, like if you go to your family physician and he sees no reason for further testing, but maybe there's something suspicious and you get an MRI or an X-ray. It works like that. Whether something can be repaired or not, pretty much most things can be repaired. The issue that comes up is if the repair cost of a condominium is so extensive that it really exceeds the value of the condominium. In other words, if each home is worth $100,000 and the cost of repair exceeds the value of all the homes, in those instances, the legislature does have procedures whereby the members can vote to terminate the condominium, where instead of repairing it, they sell the building as is, and each of the homeowners gets their share of the sales proceeds.
So somebody buys it and they either do the repairs or they tear it down and start anew.
Exactly. But the architect or engineer is not making those decisions. They're really just providing information that the board of directors and the homeowners can act upon.
Got a call from John on the South Side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Yeah, hello, this is John. I have 3 questions, actually. The first is, how does insurance calculate in the reserve studies? Because most likely these defects in the building, especially the roof, would going to be covered by insurance in case there's an accident, and we have, in that case, there would be a new roof with 30, 40 years lifespan. So how does that calculate in the reserve, knowing that the reserve is mostly related to the roof? And second question is, Mr. Ansbacher mentioned 3 three-story small buildings. I'm not aware of that small definition. As far as I know, it's 3 stories and up. You're covered by that law. And the last question is, I read the new proposed rules, and it seems like there is an aspect where if you can attain a line of credit in lieu of funding the reserve, that would be one way to mitigate the funding. I'm not sure if I interpreted it right, but
Yeah, that's a
okay.
good question. Thanks, John. I think those are all things that Barry can answer. So let's start. He was wondering if there are, in the reserve studies, if they're calculating the, for instance, the insurance.
Well, the insurance is really considered separate, even though there is a relationship. If you have defects in construction or maintenance that hasn't been done and you get a hurricane or tropical storm, it typically is going to invite more damage because a well-maintained roof is going to be more resistant. But the reserve studies are based upon just useful life or deferred maintenance or defects. So they don't take into account what if a hurricane or fire or storm came in. The assumption is that there won't be a casualty, but just with the current condition of those roof and structures and elevators in the passage of time, what will be required to maintain or replace or repair.
And reserve funds don't pay for insurance or insurance increases.
Correct. Insurance is going to be an annual operating cost. Now, because insurance coverage has gotten more challenging with the new laws, and for example, water and mold damage is limited or excluded on so many policies, some prudent condominium and homeowner associations are having not necessarily reserve, but more of a sinking fund to cover deductibles or uncovered losses. But that's really not what these structural integrity reserves are requiring. That's really just a business decision of those associations.
Okay. And his question about buildings that are required to abide by these rules being basically 3 stories and up.
There's an exception for duplexes, I think maybe 4 or 6. So when you have some very, very small condominiums, but for what we would consider the typical condominium, it's an unusual circumstance. I've had condominiums with as few as 2 units for particular reasons. So those are not included. They're really looking at what we would consider this ordinary condominium complex.
Kind of a tower, yeah. And then in terms of the rules about getting credit to help offset some of these reserve requirements, tell us about what that allows for.
We deal with this frequently, and most condominium documents provide whether the board of directors has the authority to borrow money or whether the membership has to approve a loan. So loans to condominium associations are not new, and they've been used for as long as I've been practicing law to help fund repair projects or enhancements. And that's really just the condominium association borrows money, and then through future assessments, they repay the loan. So it doesn't really change the cost. It's simply a different way of financing it rather than homeowners having to have a special assessment or go get the money through their own sources. The association can sometimes facilitate it easier by getting one loan for the whole project. That doesn't change the reserves going forward, but if you have a milestone inspection that says you have hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars in immediate repairs, then your only choices to pay for that are going to be a special assessment on the members, typically payable in very short time, or they can borrow money to stretch those payments out longer. The legislation that's proposed on the House version of the bill, 913, is not changing the ability to borrow as a concept, but it's changing the way in which the approval is done. If the House bill becomes law, then it provides that the board has the right to borrow money without membership approval. So essentially, if membership approval is required in the condo docs, it overrides that to make it easier for the board to get a loan.
The board could decide to get a loan even if it doesn't have that full the vote of all of the condo owners.
Exactly. It's really just designed to facilitate the process. It doesn't really change the underlying idea of if you borrow money, you're still paying for it. It's just how you pay for it.
And I want to talk to you about the possibility of investing that money as an option, but I first want to get to a call from John in St. John's. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for covering this topic. Given the recent incidents in Jacksonville, like the Phoenix Art Building collapse into Main Street and the city's neglect of its own properties, like 324 Broad Street in La Villa next to the courthouse, where the roof collapsed as well, shouldn't more scrutiny be placed on local government's role in enforcing building security and safety, possibly by the state? And secondly, do you know if the state knows how many condos actually were required to turn in the milestone reports? Because I've asked the city of Jacks through public information requests for months about the numbers, and they still don't know. They haven't reported that information to me. They don't know how many of the 167 associations were required to turn in the reports. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I mean, you actually have a list, I think, of those associations with you, don't you?
Right. I pulled from the Division of Condominiums. They have a registry of condominium associations as their structural integrity reserve studies have been completed. And I printed out the numbers of Jacksonville condominiums that have fulfilled that requirement through self-reporting. I don't know what the number is in terms of how many that leaves out that haven't performed that yet. There's still a grandfather year coming up for that to be completed under certain circumstances. So they're not necessarily delinquent in doing that. But John raises a really good question that's come up of if we're concerned about building safety and building collapse, why only condominiums, an office building, an apartment building, a bridge? And he's absolutely right. The maintenance of infrastructure, the passage of time, the effect of salt air on corrosion happens to all buildings, bridges, and structures. Mother Nature doesn't care what the form of ownership is. And that's been brought up as a question as to whether the focus just on condominiums is appropriate or if it should be given a broader analysis. And I think the way I get there is the legislature typically is reactive. So Champlain Towers was a condominium. This legislation was pushed in large part in response to that. I imagine if the tragedy had been an apartment complex or a courthouse, we may have had legislation focused in that direction, and it may be something that ultimately is addressed. But
Sure. And to bridges, I mean, we are seeing inspections after the Francis Scott Key collapse, so it does animate lawmakers, certainly. I want you to explain, because one of the proposals that's before the legislature would allow for some investment of those reserve funds. Can you explain what that would, who that would benefit, and why some people are concerned?
Well, one of the issues is how do you get the money to pay for the repairs and deferred maintenance and construction defects? I mean, that's the big question. And one of the ways people have contemplated doing it, and this is in Senator Bradley's bill, is maybe instead of just putting the money into money market or savings accounts or insured certificate of deposits, which is what the standard is now, could we allow investing into stocks or bonds so that you get more return on investment and therefore the money would grow faster and there'd be more funds available? And I understand that to be a positive goal. I personally have concerns, having dealt with condominium boards of different sophistication, whether despite the safeguards that the bill is trying to build in, I'm really concerned that worse than not getting maybe that extra 2 or 3% return, that the money is not wisely invested and that less sophisticated condominiums might be preyed upon by unscrupulous people to improperly invest the money. But that is in the Senate bill, not the House bill.
All right. We have a call from Sal in Fruit Cove. Good morning, Sal. Just briefly, go ahead if you can, please.
Sure. Thank you for taking my call, number one. Being a 65-year-old man, realizing that the costs are going to go up, and I planned that for my retirement, but I had no clue that it was going to jump to this proportion. So just wanted to make everybody be aware, the 30-year-olds that are on the call listening, save up, because inflation is real, as we know, with the food and gasoline and everything else occurring in our political climate. But it's a great topic that you bring up, and it's not just going to stop with the condos. It's going to spread. So just for you 30-somethings that are out there listening, start banking some money.
Yeah.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Good advice, Sal. Thank you. Just in the last minute or so we have, Barry, can you kind of tell us what you're expecting to see from the legislature as we sort of come down to the wire on this session, and what people who live in condos or are thinking about buying condos should sort of be thinking about? Should they be paying attention to anything in particular when it comes to these bills?
I think the legislation, if it passes, the House or the Senate bill, is going to make some adjustments to these processes. But the idea that they're going to go back to the old regime where each condominium association could choose to be prudent and maintain their reserves or waive them, I don't think those days are coming back. It's going to be whether there's a little bit of flexibility in the funding or not, whether there is some ability to finance. So I think the legislature's already taken the step to implement the pay-as-you-go methodology and enforce it, and I don't think that's ever going to go back to the way it was. I just think that there are going to be some hardships. There's no question, but I don't think that in and of itself is going to cause the legislature to retreat, because I think they recognize and take the position that these problems were always occurring. It's just that people weren't dealing with them, and they're going to stay the course, is what I see.
And then I did kind of allude to or mention the blacklists, which has been something that's been getting a lot of attention. And that's basically when we're seeing mortgage lenders refusing to issue, to underwrite loans to these companies, or to these condos that are in arrears or haven't done this maintenance. Is that something that is going to be impacting this region as much as South Florida?
The mortgage brokers I've talked to have not seen that as a problem here, but there really are two buckets of people who are buying and financing condominium purchases. Those who are what we call very well qualified, are putting 25% down and have excellent credit. The underwriters there look less at the condominium project and more at the financial condition of the borrower, so they're less likely to have a loan rejected. But if you're not putting that much down, or your credit maybe is not quite that sterling, the underwriters are giving greater scrutiny to what is the financial condition and the condition of the physical property of the condominium, so that they may be rejecting loans before, because they're concerned that the condominium association is not properly maintaining its accounts, or that there's going to be a huge special assessment coming that may prevent their borrower from meeting their financial obligations. And so, to the earlier question, what should you do as a buyer? I think you should sort of do what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac is doing. If you see a beautiful condominium unit, remember you're buying more than just that unit, just that 3 bedrooms. You're buying a piece of the whole project. So work with a real estate attorney, work with your real estate agent, but really look at the association itself and give that as much scrutiny as you are the unit. And remember, you're buying into the whole project.
And I have to ask this just one last question, because I saw that people can be held liable if they sell a condo, and there's been a discussion about some major assessment in the last 6 months. And even if they didn't know about it, it's in the minutes of the meeting. Can you just tell us briefly what the responsibility is there?
Well, Florida law has long been that if you're selling a residential property, you have a duty to disclose known material latent defects. And that's really what would a reasonable buyer want to know. So obviously a special assessment coming up, or if you're aware or it's been published that the building is has structural issues, that's something I think a buyer would want to know. And we're seeing a real uptick in legal claims that buyers have been bringing against sellers alleging non-disclosure or fraud, and that's certainly not something people want to have. That phone call or that letter 6 months after they sell, that, I would like the purchase price, or at least a good portion of it, back.
All right. A lot of complicated issues. Thank you for coming on, Barry Ansbacher, to help us thread through some of that and to keep an eye on the legislative session.
Thank you.
All right. Up next, a local artists collaborative. From providing gallery space to providing moral support, the Jacksonville Art Center Cooperative has spent 20 years backing First Coast artists. Here to tell us about the significance of the anniversary and how the community can join the celebration. We're joined by Ed Molesky. He's a wood turning artist and a member of the Art Center Cooperative Incorporated. Good morning, Ed.
Good morning.
We're also joined by Annalise Dycraft, founding member and president of the Art Center Cooperative. Good morning, Annalise.
Good morning.
So, why create the co-op in the first place, and how do you define an artist co-op?
Okay. In 2005, there was an art summit at MoCA, and a group of artists got together, mainly because there was no representation for non-professional artists. And so a co-op is a gathering of multiple people, and we work together. It's not like a regular gallery where an individual person represents you. We all have to pitch in and volunteer. And and we do community work as well.
Is there a membership requirement? Like, is there a payment that you make in order to become a member of the co-op?
Yes. So there's actually you submit your work, and then we look at it. There's a committee, a membership committee, and it is $60 to be a part of the co-op monthly.
Okay.
Yes.
And so right now, it's my understanding that you have 34 artists represented in the co-op that are kind of current co-op
Yes.
members.
Yes.
But a big focus of the Art Center has been like inclusivity and accessibility. Can you
Most
talk
definitely.
about how that works in terms of, providing space for the community or providing a forum for people who maybe are not part of the
Mm.
co-op?
Certainly. We have juried shows. We have about 5 a year that are open to the public, to any artist, not just members of the co-op. So members of the co-op will be in the main gallery, and then we have a specific area, a room designated for their juried shows, which includes anybody that applies to themed shows. We also do workshops for the community, so those are open, and we work with Title I schools. So we go and we do murals and also demonstrations of art and workshops in schools.
hmm Ed, what is it that brought you to kind of becoming a part and a member of the co-op?
Well, it was interesting. A number of years ago, I was up at a conference in Amelia Island about artistic self-promotion marketing. And I ran into a person there, Mary Atwood, who happened to be the president at the time. And she looked at my stuff and she says, "Come on down." And so that was back in 2011 when we were on Adams Street.
What was her pitch to you? I mean, when she says "come on down," what appeals to you about that?
Oh, the fact if you're in a more crafts oriented endeavor like I was at the time, there is no place to show anything. If you want to get you think you have some potential, and then if you can get into a community of artists, I'm telling you, that changes your perspective. Being around for the last 14 years, 15 years with artists all around you, it has really shifted the way I think about what I produce.
Can you give an example of what you mean?
I think more traditionally, if you start as a wood turner, you're turning wooden bowls, you're turning utility kind of things. Most of what I do now is sculptural. And one of the things about the Art Center shows, because they are all theme based, so now you're trying to think of how can I represent that theme with something I can produce. And the one we've just had is blooming for spring, and the piece I created there would not have been created by a typical wood turner. I can just say that.
Annalise, you have had a number of artists that you have shown there. You recently, one of your artists was recognized with a really prestigious grant, one of the Ann McDonald Baker Art Ventures Award. We actually had her on the show, Marcia Hatcher. It's a significant award. It's a $20,000, kind of like our local equivalent of like an artist genius grant to just sort of make that work and do what you do. Is that kind of recognition by somebody who is a member of the cooperative helpful? Is that important just to celebrate, or does it help you kind of get your mission and your message out a little bit?
I would say both. It definitely helps us to celebrate our member Marcia and in all that she has accomplished. But she also acknowledged that she was part of the Art Center, so she advertised that. So that's important that more word gets out about the Art Center.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so is this a space that provides like, gallery space, or are there studio spaces in there? Are people working out of there? Do you provide any supplies or kind of, help people with the production of their art?
Sure. The gallery is both gallery and studios. The current location is. We have always had both. They've not always been together. In fact, we do have two studio locations, one at the gallery on Adams and also one at Hendricks. So we have both. Um, I'm sorry, what was your other
Just kind of whether
additional?
there's any, infrastructure there to support artists as they're producing their work.
Sure. Lisa Lofton, who is our immediate past president, she does a Monday meetup, and not only members of the Art Center can come, but anybody can come and just do their art together and bounce decisions off of each other, um, encourage each other.
Mm.
Yes.
And you mentioned like Title I schools doing some murals, community outreach. I know that you do art in the park. You do some
Yes.
art for seniors. Can you just kind of give us the parameters of the outreach that you do?
So the city approached us to do workshops in various parks locations downtown because of our longstanding work, and so we've partnered with the city, and we do workshops every Saturday, and it's for different age groups. So we do that, and that has helped. And we recently did their Easter extravaganza out at Friendship Park,
Mm-hmm.
and there were tons of kids there. That was amazing. It was just fun to see. We actually did live murals with the kids there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And is that
outdoors.
partnership with the city, is that kind of part of the cultural council grant, the support that you've been getting from them, or is that different?
No, it's all part of it. The one thing about we started the grant process with the city in 2017, and one of the things that's very clear in the vetting process and all that is that what you there are very specific things giving back to the community, very specific goals that they would like you to accomplish. And one of the things that the extra funding allowed us to do was to pick up our outreach programs. And so we've been doing murals for quite a while, but now we put into our plan an objective to do at least two Title I school murals a year. During COVID time, it prompted us. We did art supplies for the kids
Mm.
because they were not prepared for not sharing art supplies in their classes. And then we have most recently picked up Kim's Open Door, which is a organization that deals with refugee kids. I'm
You
going there this afternoon to teach a workshop.
Excellent. And just briefly, you are having a celebration that the community is invited to participate in. Annalise, can you just tell us where and when?
Certainly. It's May 17. It's a Saturday. It's from 5 to 8, and it's being held at the Grand downtown, which is 300 West Adams. It's directly across from the new JEA building.
And that's a fundraiser in addition to a celebration.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Well, congratulations on 20 years. It's a
Thank
great
you.
accomplishment.
Amphitheater on Sunday, May 18th at 8 p.m. Information at theamp.com. Florida Theater presents Jim Henson's Fraggle Rock, Back to the Rock Live, featuring puppet creatures from Jim Henson's Creature Shop, classic Fraggle songs, and immersive visual effects. Sunday, May 11th at 3 p.m. Information at floridatheater.com.
Welcome to my spaceship. The Electro Lounge invites you to the Brian Gooding Planetarium at Mosh, May 30th, pairing the best sounds of the Electro Lounge with the captivating and immersive visuals of a trip through the cosmos. It's a journey that will be both intimate and expansive, scientifically rigorous yet surreal. Join us for an experience that will redefine what it means to explore the universe with music. Visit wjct.org/events for information and tickets.
Flamin' Hot Cheetos, Skittles, Mountain Dew Baja Blast, just a few of the foods that contain petroleum-based synthetic food dyes that the FDA wants to phase out by the end of next year. Will the ban change American eating habits and make kids healthier?
Doesn't mean these foods are bad or evil or poison, right? It just means these are the foods that we want kids to eat less of so that they can get all the nutrients that they need.
That's on the next On Point.
Everyone's having their say about Donald Trump's first 100 days. It's time to have yours. There's now fierce debate and concern over what the administration is doing to the economy, our culture, and foreign policy. But how has your life changed since the start of Trump's second term? We're taking your calls on Trump's first 100 days. That's next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, it was just a century ago that scientists discovering the Milky Way wasn't the entire universe. They had thought so, learning instead that it's just a tiny part of our ever-expanding actual universe. Here to tell us more about it, is Eddie Whistler. He's going to do an upcoming discussion on this at the planetarium at the Museum of Science and History. Good morning, Eddie.
Hey, good morning. Yeah, the name of it is Storms of Stars.
Storms of Stars, and I'm curious, like, why the metaphor of the storm?
It's so perfect. I'm sure I'm not the first one to have thought about it, but I feel like I independently came up with it, looking at the thing, being like, that's a hurricane. And people who come in a lot of times get caught up and just have a misunderstanding or no understanding of what a galaxy is. And so raindrops are to hurricanes, and they even look like these spiral structures that are really majestic and amazing. As devastating as a hurricane is, when you see the pictures from space, like these things, they look amazing. And so are galaxies. And so stars are to galaxies what raindrops are to hurricanes. And not exactly in the same numbers, but man, there are a lot of stars in galaxies.
Some of the, telescope images really are just unbelievable because there's almost no sort of sky or, or background. It's just all glinting stars.
Yeah. And so are you referencing the images that we have of like deep field space where then these storms of galaxies, we see them by the thousands?
I mean, I don't know. I'm looking at like beautiful Hubble photos, right?
So it's all over the place. So a single galaxy is made up of just massive amounts of stars, so much so that oftentimes you almost can't make out a single one. They're almost like, it's almost like a work of art made of chalk. You don't see individual little chalk dust grains. And yet that that's what chalk is when you lay it down, on a piece of black paper, let's say. You're looking at a picture from Hubble, and you know that it's made up of individual stars, but you can't make out a single one.
Galaxies can actually be, you can sort of compare them to a hurricane, but they can be shaped in a variety of ways.
True.
Like, describe to us what those shapes are and what significance that has in the way that they operate.
Yeah, so many that are in our matters how far away it is from us, because the further we look out, the deeper in time we look. So shapes are adjusted because they're younger and they're part of a younger universe, and they haven't been able to mature because the universe is less mature the further out we look. So that's one thing that can kind of govern the shape of a galaxy. And less mature, you could always unpack that to know what that is. But other than that, there are also interactions between galaxies, because these aren't just isolated things. They're interacting with one another over the course of billions of years. And the interaction gravitationally between galaxies can pull stars out, can, in some cases, really mess about the shapes, like complete chaos and destruction and just stars spilling out into intergalactic space. And then you have, more or less roughly isolated galaxies that are doing their own thing, looking like spirals. Really big ones look like elliptical, egg-like collections of stars. So yeah, there's lots of different ways that galaxies can be. But the majority of them in the neighborhood of us are spiral-shaped galaxies spinning around looking as beautiful as they do.
I mean, learning that we weren't the center of the universe must have been a really profound scientific revelation.
Yeah.
And I imagine was very difficult for a lot of people to comprehend. I mean, space is hard to comprehend.
No doubt. And that happened about 100 years ago. A mere 100 years ago. We know so much about the galaxies, and of course, there are tremendous mysteries as well. We're using the galaxies to kind of currently try and understand the cosmos on the large scale. We can get into that, but maybe some other time. But yes, 100 years ago, we used to think that the universe was the Milky Way galaxy, and it took a discovery by Edwin Hubble. Of course, the telescope is named after this person, to show us, for the very first time, we now know, the universe is not just our galaxy, which is already an amazingly big thing. The moment that we saw that the Andromeda cloud in the sky, that we weren't sure if it was just a dusty cloud in space in our own galaxy, we proved, as much as you could prove something in science, you don't really, but boom, that thing, that is a separate galaxy. And they got to calling them island universes.
Oh, wow.
Which is a really cool term.
That sounds exotic. This is a subject of the aptly titled Storm of Stars session that you're going to be doing on May 21st. And this is something that is going to have, obviously video elements and digital elements. And so all that we're talking about, but also pictured and more thoroughly described.
Yes, for sure. So, trying to set the scene with music and audio and visual in a dark room with a 60-foot dome overhead. Now, it is worth mentioning that this is for audiences 55 and up, and it's happening during the daytime.
Yeah.
But we have other series events that are for 13 and up and take place in the evening.
More information can be found at mosh.org.
Come on. Bring it. Come check us out.
Eddie Whistler, it's always so fun to talk to you about space and space things. Thanks for doing this.
Super welcome.
All right. And that's our program. Thank you for listening, especially everybody who called and emailed. If you have comments or questions, you can always send them to First Coast Connect at WJCT.org. And please join us tomorrow when we talk to the author of a new investigation into decades of contamination and cover-ups at a Clay County hazardous waste site. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. AEG presents Kenny G. The contemporary jazz artist will bring his smooth and soulful saxophone melodies to the Florida Theater on Wednesday, May 7th at 8 p.m. Tickets available at floridatheater.com.